apps. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have myself, Gibran Ali, solution architect based out of Dubai from Fast Track team, and Kuntal Ghoshal, solution architect based out of Australia. Kuntal, over to you to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully I'm audible. Thank you for joining the session. My name is Kuntal Ghoshal. I live in Sydney, Australia. And as my co-presenter mentioned, we will be talking about long-term data retention with Dataverse CE apps today. Let us get started. So we will be talking on the following agendas. We'll go through an overview of long-term data retention, where we will talk about what this core feature is all about, what it does, why we built it. We will provide an experience on how to enable this feature. And effectively, when we are doing the retention of data, it is not complete unless we are providing a way to view and manage that data from the retention store. So we will talk about view and manage the retention data. We will also share for organization how they can delete the data that is in the retained store. We will give a little bit of perspective about how you as a partner can start this discussion with customer early enough on data and what is the value props of having this sort of conversation, followed by some FAQ, and we will definitely have some time for your answering your question. Throughout this presentation, if you have any question, please do not hesitate to post it. Either me or my friend Gibran, we will be able to answer you. With that, let's get started. So we will talk about overview of Dataverse long-term data retention, and in some spaces, you will see we call it as LTDR, which is an abbreviation of long-term data retention. Now, to start about any feature or talk about any feature, we cannot correctly describe that feature unless we talk a little bit about the context. Long-term data retention as a feature, it was an ask from our Dynamics 365 customers for a long time. If you look at it, for any implementation, customers bring a lot of data from different sources, especially their line of business application, into Dynamics. And for most of the customers, they need this data for transactional purposes for a limited set of time. For some customers, it is 3 years. For some customers, it is little longer. And then after this time frame passed, there should be a way to make this data inactive and available only as needed basis. Now, if we take this particular requirement and put it into the perspective of volatility of the data, we can find out that we easily classify data into active data, inactive data, and then deleted data. These sort of ideas or these sort of customers' questions, scenarios helped us to build the long-term data retention. What we do through long-term data retention, there are active data, which is needed for the transactional purposes. Then there is data that the customer doesn't require on a regular purposes and only require as needed for compliance security purposes. So this long-term data retention can move that data into a less expensive store, which will effectively manage the cost of this. Now, Microsoft built this feature because if customer has to implement something like that, they need to be cognizant about a lot of regulation when they are moving the data, as well as security that needs to be applicable on that data that is moved out of Dataverse. That is one of the reasons that we built this product, where the data is not moving outside of Dataverse. That is very, very critical concept. Data never moves outside of Dataverse. It always resides on a database, but it moves to a much cheaper storage. And that is where the retained data stays there and only accessed on demand. Now, during this process, one of the very important thing that we also consider is performance, because most of you are working with Dynamics, and you know there are API consideration, there are API threshold, there are performance impact. When we built this feature, we had to keep that in mind. And one of the very important aspect of having this feature is it doesn't have any performance impact. So customers can retain their data from active storage or transactional storage to the cold storage inside Dataverse without impacting any performance. So this, as I was explaining earlier, this feature is to enable customer for moving their inactive data for the historic, for viewing only for compliance and regulatory purposes. And effectively, it helps them to reduce the overall storage cost. Now, customers, when they are doing it, they do not need to think about bringing additional infrastructure or any maintainability, because effectively data stays inside Dataverse in the cold storage. So all the security that is applicable to Dataverse in terms of GDPR, in terms of customer managed keys, if your customer is using, all of them will still be applicable into the cold storage. Any sort of Dataverse standard table, there can be exception in terms of system table. For example, the principal object access table, we don't export that. But any sort of standard table, including your custom table and anything related to attachment, images, all of them, it can be retained into the long-term storage. The security is maintained across Dataverse. So the long-term storage or cold storage has got the similar security as the hot storage or Dataverse storage. And again, the API is also, Dataverse API can also interact with this data for reading and deleting this data. And we'll talk more about that in the coming slide, but this is like giving a snapshot of this feature. And this retained data can be accessible into many ways. Like we can access it through Advanced Find, we can access it through Power Automate, and there is a dedicated API, which we'll talk more about in the coming slide. With that, effectively, the long-term data retention, what is really interesting here, when the data moves from transactional data to the cold storage, there is a compression that happens. And that is how the saving in storage is happening for customer. For example, when your transactional data store, let's assume that you have, let's say, 100 rows. You are moving that 100 rows is resulting to, let's say, 100 megabytes, and you are moving it to 50 of those rows, you are moving it to a cold store, which effectively will be 50 megabytes. But what we observed is that when we do the compression, there is a lot more savings, on average 50 to 80% of less capacity, and that less capacity, the customer will be paying less. So the inactive data move to the cold storage will effectively give them a lot more storage capacity without impacting the performance. Another very, very important thing, once a parent record is chosen for retention, all related child tables will be chosen by default. So for example, your parent record you are choosing is contact account, and that has a contact, that is an incident, and whatever record that you had set up as a child record, all of them by default will move to the retention store when you are moving the parent record. Let's talk a little bit about the process flow, how we do it. So when and we'll talk about the detail about setting up policies and everything in the coming slides. So I'm not going into those details, but effectively on a high level, when you mark a particular record that I want to, let's take an example that I want to delete all contacts created 3 years or more in my organization. So then that is the condition that you are setting. When you set that condition, what happens is we have an API, internal API, and a framework which takes that filter criteria, and then asynchronously, on the time when your platform is not active, that asynchronous job triggers, and then it marks based on the result set of that filter criteria. it marks all those records for archival. The next step is another framework triggers internally, which check all this marked record and move it to the cheap, copy this record to the cheap cold storage. The third step is the most important thing, reconciliation, because once we copy from the hot storage or transaction to cold storage, we need to make sure that all the row set, all the records are copied. So reconciliation is very, very important to make sure we are not losing any data. And the last stage is purge. Once the reconciliation is completed and we figure out that, okay, 100 record, we should be moving from hot storage to retained storage, and we moved those 100 records, then the purge trigger and it deletes those records from the source system, which is Dataverse. Now, during this process, at any stage, if the reconciliation is failing, then this whole transaction will be rolled back. So we will not do the purge. We will rather again start this process from moving that marked records to data lake. Let's talk a little bit about prerequisites. Now, this particular feature doesn't incur any cost. There is no licensing capability that you need to purchase additionally. And it was on private and public preview for a long time, currently generally available and available across all regions. Now, only thing that we need to think of is the permission that are required. So to create the long-term data retention, the user must be any sort of system administrator or system customizer or Power Platform administrator. And the tenant must have eligibility to create managed environment. These are all publicly documented information. There might be some changes coming in the near future in terms of eligibility and prerequisite, but that's not related to the licensing at this stage. Now, let's talk about storage optimization. We kind of talked a little bit in the previous slide, but let's take a real example of how storage optimization is done. So if you take a database of Contosho, for example, where we have got 1,000 GB of data, and you defined a filter criteria which will move 200 GB of data through long-term retention to the cold storage, effectively what will happen is this 200 GB of data that is moving will be compressed, and depending on your sort of customization and data structure, this actual compressed volume can be more or less. But what on an average we have seen, the compression in retained store gives us 50% or more savings. So when you move it to the cold storage, there will be a 50% saving, which will effectively mark the 200 GB of data to 100 GB. So now earlier Contosho had 1,000 GB. Now we move 200 GB out of that 1,000 GB to the cold storage. This 200 GB became 100 GB. Effectively, Contosho will now have 800 GB on active storage, 100 GB on cold storage, and in total they will be paying for 900 GB. So they are in reality they will be saving like 100 GB. Now imagine on a real-time scenario where your customer has got a lot more, or they are setting a filter criteria which is actually moving a lot more than 200 gigabytes of record. So that in those scenarios, this saving will be significant for your customer. With that, let's talk more about enabling this feature. I will invite Gibran to talk about this.
Thanks, Kuntal. So the enabling feature of long-term data retention can be done through the maker experience. So as I said, with an admin persona, you can log into the maker experience where you can go and select the table that you want to enable the feature on. It is normally at the properties of the table under the advanced properties. And once you click that drop down, the side panel will load. Give it a few seconds. Sometimes it will show up as disabled, but it enables itself once the scripts and the FCD settings in the backend have loaded. So once you have that, clicking on enable long-term data retention on any table will take any child tables for, as Kuntal mentioned previously, for into the long-term data retention feature, right? Now, one of the key things, again, nugget to share over here is that it could take anywhere between 15 to 30 minutes after you save this setting for the table to be available to set retention policy, which we'll talk about. And of course, the larger the number of child tables, the longer it might take to complete this process, right? One of the things that happens after, once you finish doing that, the next step is identifying the data that needs to be moved to long-term data retention store, right? Now, for that, what we do as a feature is ask you to create a view which kind of filters out on the data that needs to be moved on. So in this example on the screen, we're looking at the cases that were created on or before December 31st, 2015, which is a good way of starting. And once you create this view, you can set this view within the retention policies. Retention policies, as highlighted by Kuntal in the previous screens, is the way that we kind of identify and say, hey, run this policy, move this policy to long-term data retention store. Now, one of the best practices that we talk to our customers about as fast track architects is like, hey, what would be the impact, identifying the impact of running such a query, right? Like moving inactive cases that were created. One of the ways you could do is modify the query to be top 10, top 20 records and run it to understand if the records being retrieved by the filters that you're creating or by the view are an alignment, right? Like just to verify the record before you just go implement it, move it to the long-term data store, because once the policy is enabled, it will run at scheduled time and start moving the data across as per the processes and high-level steps highlighted by Kuntal. Right, so to put a guardrail against anything, verification is always good. And I tell all the customers that engage with us that, hey, do verify that. Now, how do you do that? You can do it through the TDS endpoint by using SQL Server Management Studio, by, running the top 10 query for the same, or by creating a view that builds this and modifying fetch XML to say fetch top 20 and then updating the view with that. So that's, one of the best practices I would recommend. Like every time you're trying to create a retention policy, you define the edit filter criteria before you enable it. Make sure you run it and understand the view outcome before you implement it. Okay. One of the other things that I wanted to highlight is, right, if the parent cases have associated from child tables, right, and like from nodes, task, or custom tables, we will of course go in all the tables underneath it, and specifically in case, for example, you would have the lookup values denormalized, right? So you would have the lookup values denormalized on the retain store with ID and name values. This is how we retain lookup data during within the cold store side of things. So the reason being, there are certain limitations which Kuntal will double click on for viewing data as highlighted with some limitations previously. So it allows us to do the single query side of things. Now, once you have the view created, you need to then go and create a new retention policy. This is again from the maker experience. You go onto the page, and then in the left-hand pane, you can say retention policies. You can click on new retention policy, and it gives you a window where you can actually, put the select table, give a name to the retention policies. The criteria is the view that you created within Dynamics or Dataverse, which is resolved cases, and schedule is when you want to start the retention policy to take into effect. it is also has frequency, which is certainly between during daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly. And that is the iteration, how often do you want this policy to run? And once you do that, you can click OK, and that will create the job that would start looking at what those retention high-level execution steps are. Now, one of the, again, key thing to highlight over here is that you need to understand that a policy can take anywhere between 72 to 96 hours, irrespective of the data volume, right? Data volume as data retention policies, as Kuntal mentioned, are given a low priority by the platform. This is how the architecture is done. Dataverse will always run the retention policies in the background to avoid any impact on any other platform services, such as apps and flows, right? So this is what the policy looks like. Now, viewing and managing the retention policy. Once you create a retention policy, what are your options in terms of managing the policy, right? What we have is within the retention policies, within the maker experience, if you go to that section, you will have all the listed policies that you have created. Once you select one of the given policies, a few other options emerge on your command bar with buttons like history, policy details, deactivate, and delete. Now, history gives you, let me start with the policy details argument. If you wanted to modify the existing policy, then you go to policy details and you will be able to modify that. You can deactivate a policy. So once you enable long-term data retention, you can only disable the retention for a particular table by deactivating its policy. And you have to deactivate, if you have multiple policies running on this given table, then you'd have to deactivate all policies in a given table for the data retention to stop on that table. And you can delete policies. The policies is basically just deleting the job that goes in the background to archive the data into cold store, right? Now, looking at the history side of things, this is one of the key areas which provides detailed view of a policy runs. This run view is talking about the details of a policy runs. Now you can see that run IDs are there, there's status, there's start date and end date. There are run detail view can easily be called just by clicking on the policy itself and selecting one of the views, run IDs, and the details pane comes out from the right side of things. Okay. Some of the key aspects that I wanted to highlight, of course, are the retained data count, right? Like, so when the policy runs, depending on the filter criteria, it kind of, you have set on the retention policy, you would be able to see what data was impacted in that particular run. Now, it could be cases, accounts, whatever it might be. The other bit that is important that I wanted to highlight was the status. Now, Kuntal mentioned this, that within the flow of moving the data, there are multiple stages that we do. And this is what is highlighted or reflected when you look at the status. The scheduled is one of the status. Let me go through some of the steps. So scheduled is where the policy has been scheduled to run, right? In progress is when the policy is of moving and changing the data from active to non-active, which is the retained data store for the records within the root and the child tables, right? Pending reconciliation. We talked about reconciliation is a very important step before we progress. So pending reconciliation is a status during which we're waiting to reconcile the retained rows in Dataverse long-term retention. Next step normally is in process of reconciliation. During this stage, we ensure that no data loss by reconciling the retained rows to the original rows before delete from active, right? This is what we talked about. Pending delete, waiting to delete all retained records. Then in progress of deletion is the status where we are actually trying to delete all of the retained rows from the application. Completed is where the process is completed. And of course, failed. Failed is where the retention process failed. Now, it would show you failed on what records or what table it failed on. Now, double click. One of the best practices that I highlight to most of the customers to understand, any failures on moving the LTDR store of the primary or child records. You can query the Dataverse table retention failure details for error details. The columns, this is as well documented in our alert, but the columns that are valuable are the operation entity, ID, environmental logical, entity logical name. The message is very critical. This is, if you query this, you will be able to, get the details of what the failure was on a particular run. Now, how do you want to query it? Through the ES endpoint or by creating? I normally recommend my customers to create a model-driven app with the required tables and use it as the administration app for long-term data detention feature. So this is where you can get. This is how you can get the details of retaining the errors and understanding what your policies are.
Thanks, Gibran. I will now talk about how we can effectively view the retained data. So far, we learned about what is the retention, long-term data retention, how we can set the long-term data retention, what are the best practices, how the data moves, and everything. Now, the data goes to the long-term retention or the cold storage, and unless there is a way to access that data moving there is not solving any problem. So now let's talk about how we can access that. One thing to talk about is the security roles required. Now, from the very beginning, we keep saying the reason we built this feature is we wanted the same Dataverse security to flow into the cold storage as well. So security roles that are applicable for your Dataverse will also be applicable to the long-term, to the cold storage as well. Now, let's talk about a real-time scenario. For example, you have moved your account or contact records into the cold storage, and one of the external auditor needs access to that contact record from the cold storage. The way it could be done is for that particular record that he needs access, he can be given organization level read access on that particular table. And by virtue of that, he will also have access to that table in the cold storage. So the same security model that we have for Dataverse, it flows into that cold storage as well. Now, let's talk about different ways of viewing the data. So we have got advanced find. Advanced find, everyone from Dataverse, I don't need to explain it. We can also access the retained data through Power Automate, and we normally use Power Automate to populate external sources. Now, one thing from a best practice perspective that we need to be aware of, Power Automate typically will get timeout or can get timeout if you are exporting a very large data set like an attachment, which gets exported into base64. Now, if you are exporting attachment and using Power Automate, the timeout might occur, and in those scenarios, the recommended way is the export retained data. That's the message that we specifically built to access this data through API. Let's talk about advanced find. So if you have enabled the long-term data retention, this is where once you go and search for the particular table, if that table has got the cold storage data as well, you can see there is this particular filter criteria which says which needs to be toggled from hot storage or transactional storage to cold storage to get the retained data. Now, one thing that we all need to understand, these retained data are purpose-built to be accessed very less frequently. So the performance of accessing retained data will not be comparable against when you access your transactional data. Let's move on and talk about few of the known limitations. Now, some of them, I don't say these are limitations, but some of them are something that our partners should be across when they are building long-term data retention. So currently there is a 5 concurrent user and 100 queries per day per environment limit. If this is a hard limit that you are affected with, you can always move to Fabric to view the data, and we'll talk about that in coming slide. The joins and aggregation functions are not supported when you are moving data. So through advanced find, if you want contact and then related opportunities or any custom tables, you will not be able to get it. From the query result, you cannot create a personal view in Dataverse like you do for your live data or transactional data. Any call that you are making through advanced find or Power Automate, that is considered as one API call. Lookup values, Gibran already mentioned earlier, it is normalized, and currently Power BI has limitation to connect with the retained data store. With that, I will quickly play a video which will show how long-term data retention works. Let me just play the video.
Long-term data retention functionality allows organizations to get immediate and ongoing benefits to securely retain historical data long-term in Dataverse, reduce historical data in live applications and database capacity, avoid IT investment to build and maintain custom solutions. Let's look at the scenario. I'm an admin in a data and compliance business group, and I have a regulatory requirement to store historical data from my Dataverse D365 application, which I will access very rarely. I plan to use the new Dataverse long-term retention functionality. I go to Power Apps Maker portal and select retention policies. I want to define a retention policy on an account table. My policy for retention of dormant accounts in a specific region, and I give it a name that is relevant and easy to find later. Now I choose the criteria, which is in Dataverse view for historical accounts. The view was previously created and well tested. I select the date and set the frequency. Save it. I land on a dashboard. It includes another policy on the case table I had set up previously. The dashboard allows me to view the history of a policy, view and edit policy details, deactivate the policy, and delete the policy permanently. When I click on Run History, I see run results. Selecting the run, I can view all records and including the related child tables involved. The key point here, this feature allows you to define a policy on a parent root table and data from a read and child table become part of the retention. Now, how do I view historical data? I go to the advanced find, select cases and advanced find. Use change to retain available for me as an admin. Enter criteria. And there is my data. I can view all my retained data in a read-only grid. With Dataverse long-term retention, it's very simple to set retention policies, secure the retained data, reduce the Dataverse storage consumption. Thank you.
Let's move on to our next slide. And here we'll be talking about how we can view the retained data through Fabric. Now you know that the excess of retained data has got a few limitations in terms of concurrency and how many total call you can make in terms of API. When you are using Fabric, those sort of limitations are not there. So for connecting your Dataverse data to Fabric, what you need to do is enable the Fabric shortcut. And once you enable the Fabric shortcut, what's going to happen is all the active and the inactive data that you have stored, they will be that you have enabled. They will be accessible through Fabric. And there, in the Fabric, you can use your SQL to query all the data. If you want to get active, if you want to get inactive, there is no limit in terms of API. You can get Power BI directly connecting to your Fabric or OneLake and run reports that are required for your business. And all the limitations that we talked about earlier are not applicable here. Only thing that you need to remember, as we get both active and inactive data for any particular table, when you are trying to access the inactive data, you need to put a condition where MSFT underscore data state equals to 1. That is the data state for inactive record. With that, how do we, this is like a logical architecture of how the Fabric can be enabled for long-term data retention. And as you can see here, we have got Dataverse, where we have the live data. We have got custom policies, which Gibran had shown you how to enable these custom policies and use Dataverse filters to move the data from the transactional database to cold storage. And from cold storage, once you enable Fabric, that's when this will be available through Fabric. We will not copy this cold storage or retained data again. There is no copy, no ETL, as it is already available in Fabric, and you can access this data easily through Power BI or through SQL with that data state. Over to you, Gibran, for deleting retained data.
Right. So now we've talked about moving data from live store to cold store and having that as an option. We've talked about how you can view it, the different modes and options we have available for viewing that data and interacting with that data. What happens if you want to, how do you go about and delete the data from the long-term data store? Now, if you look at the UI, when you look at the video or the screens grabs that it's shown, we don't allow the deletion of data from the long-term data retention store from the UI. We allow it through a bulk delete option created using the SDK. Now, these are your out-of-box Dataverse bulk delete jobs that, if when created using the Dataverse SDK, will support the long-term data retention store. And how do we support that? So within the code, you can specify the data source to be set to retained store. Now, on the example given, and we have published this on the Learn Docs as well, as there were so many queries coming around to this. This is a simple example that, hey, this is the data store retained, where it is looking at all the accounts within the retained store. It doesn't have the condition added to it. So again, if you wanted to delete the records that were meeting a certain criteria, you would add the condition over here. As you can see within the code, you have a start date time, which defines when the deletion would start. Recurrence pattern. You can set all these parameters. These are out of the box bulk delete job patterns that you can enable through code. And once you create this code and create through a console application and then push it, there are two ways. One's through the SDK, the code side of things in C# code, and the other is you going through the C# but Fetch XML side of things. In Fetch XML as well, you'd need to point it out to the data source to be retained, provide the filters, and once you run that, what it will do is go and create a bulk delete job within the Dynamics application or within the Dataverse ecosystem. Now that, again, can continue running and remove records. Now, again, as I told you about archiving data side of things, right? Understand the impact it would have on your delete store as well. When you are looking to delete records from long-term data retention, have a look, as Kuntal mentioned, you can use Fabric to avoid the limitations of queries. Have a look at the query through Fabric in understanding how many records it would be impacting and whether those records meet your criteria and stuff along those lines. Always a good best practice that we say is have a verification process, a guardrail of verification process before executing these jobs, because once you create these jobs, you can't modify it within the bulk delete UI. You need to delete and recreate them again. So this is how we recommend. This is what we talk to our customers about, highlight as a key best practice as well. Right. I think so far the presentation approach was like what the feature is, what are the key areas to highlight, and what are the key aspects that we as Fast Track believe that a customer should understand about the feature itself. Then we wanted to add the section as our experiences have been with the customer. So how do we as Fast Track architects engage with customers who want to understand how we can place this feature as a benefit for them? This is our conversation. So we wanted to bring that back to the team over here, to the people involved over here, and understand how we can engage in conversations. What we kind of highlight is that the most important aspect is to start the discussion about data, right? Like especially in projects like migration projects, where there is a move from one system to Dynamics Online, and we see that there are lots of data being migrated. We as Fast Track, when we do SBR review and we're looking at your review questions and talking with customers and engaged partners, we're trying to understand ourselves that, hey, what is the solution entailing of? Are they bringing in all the data? Sometimes, most of the times, customers go like, no, we're going to reduce the data by leaving the data on premise or leaving it into SQLs online. And then the question that we put in front of is like, is it necessary that you do it that way? How would you handle the security to the data? How would you manage the access to the data? How would you manage the compliance of GDPR for EU regulations that we are based out of? All these things, all these conversations make them understand that it is more complex to build a custom solution and retain the data in another store than to migrate and then set the retention policies to move the data to retention store and keep it there for their compliance reasons, right? Now, with net new projects, we kind of engage on like, hey, what is your engagement going to be like? What are your, year-on-year and month-on-month projected data growth like? What is the compliance requirements for keeping this data in transactional system? What are the scenarios of accessing the cold store? These are the kind of questions that we raise to our customers in terms of understanding what the data needed, and you can set a policy from the get-go to be compliant on those. This is one of the things that we really try and get across during our conversations. Like besides the obvious conversation of like, hey, you have a cost benefit of not keeping the data active, inactive data in active store, or it has benefits in terms of security and compliance being offered out of box. And these are some of the best practice nuggets that we kind of proposition for the feature during the conversations we have with our customers and partners. Kuntal, do you want to add something to it?
No, Gibran, you very well articulated it. Just one recommendation here based on our involvement with our customers and a number of implementation. Have this discussion early enough. Maybe as part of your non-functional requirement, capture these compliance requirement as well, and understand what is the organization's policy in terms of keeping that data. For financial organization, it can be 3 years to 7 years. For public sector, we have seen it can be 7 to 10 years, sometimes even less. So have those discussions early enough. Educate your customers that keeping the data is in your main transactional system is a costly affair. And then based on that, define those policies, even though you are not defining them from the day one, but customer knows that this is something that they will be doing down the line, maybe 3 years, 5 years down the line, to start moving the data to a cheaper storage so that their maintainability, manageability, and cost are all covered up. I'll quickly move into FAQ. Now, we have a FAQ section in our public documentation where we listed a lot more than this. The reason we picked few of these. They are really, really important. And we wanted to talk about them. We wanted to understand if you have any more questions on this, right? Now, the one of the questions that we receive very frequently that why D365 is restricting access to retained data when data lake is cheap. Now, the data lake or the cold storage is a cheaper option, but we also need to understand the format of moving that data into that cold storage and then accessing it. All this requires compute, and this compute is super expensive. So the reason the customer is saving cost is because we want this data to be less frequently accessed. Now, once it moves to the cheaper storage, and then if this data is very frequently accessed, the compute to bring this data available to customers will be massive. And that is the reason there is the restriction put in place today, so that the 100 calls and 5 concurrent calls and all these limitations are there. If you need more access, we always have the Fabric way where you can go and connect to Fabric OneLake and do whatever you want to with that data from OneLake. Gibran, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. This was a question asked in the Q&A as well. So this, as Kuntal said, like we wanted to bring out the ones that we thought were consistently being asked and highlight over here. Now, one of the other common ones that we really get asked a lot is like, hey, we have Synapse Link, and once we move the data from the active store to long-term data retention, would it go and delete the data from my own lake as well? No. The simple answer is no. But the only answer is no, we don't do that. You can have the Synapse Link for Dataverse and move all of your application data, or replicate all of your application data to your own data lake. You can set up a long-term data retention policy, which goes and changes the state of records from your active store to bring it to long-term data. During the process that we do this, we have internal logic that highlights to Lake that this data is being moved to long-term data retention store and is not to be deleted from the managed Lake side of things. So we have that within our internal logic to kind of be implemented and executed. As I said, in short, we don't go and delete from your own lake. That's owned by you, that's managed by you, that's accessible by you. But we have logic that helps us to make sure that our logic that replicates doesn't take that away. Right? Thanks.
Okay, and this is going to be the last of the FAQ that we'll talk about today, and then we'll move to Q&A. So we get this question very, very frequently. When do I use Synapse Link, and when do I use long-term data retention? Now, there is a fundamental difference between Synapse Link and long-term data retention. First, Synapse Link, Azure Synapse Link for Dataverse, that moves Dataverse data seamlessly, continuously from transactional store. Move is a wrong word. That copies and replicate the Dataverse data seamlessly from the transactional database to customer's own lake. And it doesn't actually do anything to the source system. So the data in Dataverse remains in its original form. Whereas the long-term data retention, it moves the data inside the cold storage in Dataverse. The data never leaves Dataverse, and it effectively deletes the data from source. So long-term data retention, you only enable on the data that you need very frequent access for compliance purposes. Synapse Link, you enable when you need the transactional data replicated in your own data lake for analytical and reporting purposes. Another very important thing to understand here is that Dataverse security model doesn't get replicated in your own lake. So when you use Synapse Link, you need to create your own security model and policies to govern the data that is exported from Dataverse. Whereas in long-term data retention, data never leaves Dataverse. It is a part of Dataverse data the similar kind of Dataverse security model still applicable into this. With that, Gibran, can we move to the question and answer section? We have still got around 6 minutes.
Sure. Yeah, I think there was a follow-up question in terms of, depending on the chat, and I'll bring it over for everyone's benefit. Is the record only retrieved once into MS Fabric reporting? So the given record should only be either the LTDR retained record or the record is in the active record. We would not expect the record to be retrieved from both places at any point in time to avoid double counting. So once you move the record from active store to long-term data retention store, and the purge of that record happens at the active store, it doesn't exist in active store. It only exists in the long-term data retention store.
Awesome. If there is no question, Gibran, over to you.
Yeah.